Welcome to this series of Bond University broadcasts. My name is Raoul Mortley, and these are sponsored by Dr. Alan Chan, and we will outline an introduction to the philosophy of Confucius and of others in the Chinese tradition. Thank you for joining me. The Confucian Way has been behind the culture not only of China but also Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and it's also an influence with a large number of Chinese abroad, the Chinese diaspora. Confucius was born and worked in Shandong province in China, and he lived and died in 479 BC. He lived a bit before Socrates in Greece, who died in 399 BC. Following the death penalty awarded to him by an Athenian court. Comparisons have been drawn between Confucius and Socrates. Confucius lived and taught in a period where the traditional structures were breaking down. The Zhou dynasty did not end until 256 BC, but there is a sense in which its hold on society was breaking, and it was no longer clear that there was a given and unquestionable code of behaviour. Socrates began asking questions about the nature of goodness, and during the heyday of the Athenian democracy, he was prominent, almost as a critic. The democracy was a new form of government, which replaced the old aristocratic governance. Similarly, there were questions about how we should behave in the time of Confucius, as obedience to the overlord, simple fealty to the lordship of the given rulers of any dynasty was no longer enough. Thus, the quest to define or explain goodness. In a time of intense social change, and where the old order and the old way of life was breaking down, there arose questions about how we ought to live. It was given to Socrates to crystallize these in ancient Athens, and to Confucius to ask similar questions in China. It's important to note that Confucius did not see himself as an innovator, and he presents his ideas as simply recovering the essence of traditional ethics. Sometimes philosophers working in a tradition tend to deny that they are innovating, when in fact they are. There are complex reasons for this, and also for the opposite phenomenon, namely those philosophers who claim to be saying something new when it is in fact deeply rooted in tradition. Some cultures favour tradition. Our Western culture at the present time favours the new, and innovation is greatly prized, even to the extent that it is sometimes fake innovation. Socrates asked, "What is goodness?" and kept trying different answers, always or implicitly or explicitly criticising the values of his society, the ideal of the gentleman statesman. Confucius asks the same question and seeks to define goodness through the picture of the humane or benevolent person, the quality of Ren, R-E-N. How do we translate this word? It's very elusive, partly because Confucius' comments themselves are quite elusive. If you need to read the Analects, you'll know what I mean. The sayings attributed to Confucius and preserved in the traditional collection known as the Analects are often cryptic and puzzling. But this is a characteristic of wisdom literature. The parables of Jesus are hard to interpret, and there's no one meaning which can be considered authoritative. The Delphic oracle in Greece always spoke in riddles. Confucius certainly did not make it easy for his followers, but this, of course, makes you think long and hard about what is said. It makes you internalize the thought through having followed different pathways with it, and it avoids the trap of being propositional. The legacy of Greek thought, being combined with Christian thought in the period of the Roman Empire, was that Christian theology was then understood in a series of propositions, all of which were compatible, or at least recognizable, from the philosophy of Aristotle. Socrates in the Meno asks what goodness is, and then he objects to the fact that all he gets from the people he is talking to is examples. I ask a simple question, he says, and all I get is a swarm of bees, a flood of examples of good things. Socrates thinks that examples are for the weak-minded. It's precisely the opposite with Confucius. He teaches through examples and thinks that in matters of behaviour, the only way to make progress in understanding is via concrete examples in given situations. So how do we translate this word ren? It is usual to refer to it as humaneness or benevolence. The idea of the term is that it is the quality of being fully human. But words like benevolence seem slightly wrong. It reminds one of the Stoic benevolentia, in Latin, a combination of benevolence and goodwill, a quality which has often been compared to the Christian love, or agape in Greek. It sometimes sounds slightly woolly, but this seems slightly wrong for Confucius, as it refers to a state of mind, whereas Confucius' examples always involve behaviours in different contexts. One can find similarities with the Christian ethic. In Analects 12:22, for example, Fan Chi inquires about Ren, and the master says, "Love others." Then Fan Chi requires about realizing, as, and the master says, "Realize others." This example shows both love and also the constructing and building approach towards other people, a requirement of specific constructive activity which contributes to the other person in a lasting way. Perhaps the clearest statement about Ren, which we will translate as humaneness, and the passage which gives us the clearest word picture of the Confucian person, is found in Analects 17:6, where Confucius says that humaneness requires the 5 attitudes to be put into practice, and the 5 attitudes are deference, tolerance, making good on one's word, diligence, and generosity. That's the translation of Ames and Rosemont. Let those qualities stick in your mind, but most of all, deference. It comes up over and over and is closely associated with modesty. An older translation has gravity for deference, but our translation suggests a subdued manner, not domineering or active or aggressive. So Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont, after a good deal of consideration, choose the word authoritative, and their translation, authoritative person, is the one which runs throughout their version of the Analects. Most people prefer to stick to humaneness, though. Authoritative, I suppose, has a slightly forbidding tone to it, and connotes a kind of overbearingness, which may not sound right to people familiar with the Confucian tradition. The older translation by James Legge, which is available along with the Chinese characters on the web at ctext.org, tends to use the word superior, so that the superior character is one who follows the way, and so on. Sometimes he uses the expression men of principle, in 14.4, for example, but the term superior also has its disadvantages, as in English it's evolved a bit. No one says X is a superior type of person and means a compliment by such a remark these days. So let's look again at this quality of humaneness and try to work out why Ames and Rosemont have opted for the use of the word authoritative. At first sight, these would seem to be completely different concepts. In the numerous examples of Ren given by Confucius, there is certainly an aspect of what one might call impact, in the sense that the humaneness of the character being depicted certainly has its effect on people. It conveys a certain authority to them. So the truly humane qualities are not only present, but impact on those around about, and more importantly, are recognised by those around such a person. So one can see why it's necessary to get across some idea of the authority of such a person. It's something like the ancient Roman idea of auctoritas, which referred to the informal power of a person, let's say, embodying the ideals of the Republic, perhaps, and who therefore impacted on other people who tended to recognise the informal authority of that person. It's about willingness to be influenced and to be led by people of such moral qualities that they stand out. It's the recognition of something special about a person. There is also the idea of grace in Western thought, charis, which is familiar from both Christian and pagan antiquity, Christian and pagan sources, and that's a state of being touched by something from above, bathed in a special light, perhaps, but given the special endowment which comes from the transcendent. A halo, so to speak, as it came to be pictured later. It's commonly said that there is no transcendent in the Confucian tradition, only the immanent. And that might be right, although there is often mention of that which is above and that which comes from above. We'll return to this issue, but in the meantime, let us note that the authority which is seen to be held by the person characterised by Ren or humaneness does not come from above, is not ordained by the transcendent, and does not have the characteristic of that which comes from another world. The humane individual simply is authoritative, and that authority comes from within the society which surrounds that individual. There are not two worlds, with one momentarily entering the other, the lower one. The Analects 4:25 tells us that virtue does not remain by itself, as it will immediately attract neighbours. There is the idea that there is a magnetism about goodness, so that there is no need to worry about being friendless or isolated if you have virtue. People will come to you. This magnetism is what gives the humane person his or her authority. Again, a kind of authority. The paragon of humaneness will also be forthcoming. Says Confucius, men of principle are sure to be bold, but those who are bold may not always be men of principle, in Legg's translation. In both cases, here Ames and Rosemont translate by authoritative rather than men of principle, as Legg has it. Nevertheless, my point here is that, notwithstanding the translation issues, the quality of Ren does carry with it an element of boldness and outspokenness. The person with humane values is not necessarily quiet or self-effacing. This is not always emphasized, of course, as the person with humane values is not necessarily preachy or overtly virtuous, loudly virtuous, shall we say, on all occasions. The humane person is not like that. Sometimes some passivity or quietness is in order. This underlines the many-sidedness of this quality of humaneness. It can be bold, forthcoming, or it can be tacit and merely understood, depending on the context. Socrates, in pursuit of his own understanding, looked for an absolute goodness, some kind of sovereign goodness, to borrow the words from Iris Murdoch, who wrote a book called The Sovereignty of Good, exactly on this issue as raised by Socrates. As well as writing novels, she wrote a book on Plato. Plato was variously Socrates' co-author, scribe, dramatist, literary agent, and master puppeteer. While Socrates sought an absolute virtue, Confucius sees something which is situational and which requires various responses at various times. Goodness is a path to be followed, not an absolute. This path will lead in different directions and into different contexts and situations. Whilst it is customary to regard Confucius as an exponent of tradition, we should not neglect the idea that he was revolutionary in his time and attracted a great deal of attention because his views were challenging, not because they were easy. The idea that we must be better than our teachers, or at least that we must not bend from our own standards even if they are flawed in some way, this is not an easy principle, nor is it one of slavish obedience. It's an ethic of obedience to a higher calling, the ethic of letting one's standards be the best standards, irrespective of what is around you. Thank you for joining me, and in the next talk we will look further at humaneness and how Confucius attempts to describe it negatively.